Welcome to Late Night Horror Stories and True Crime. Tonight's tale is based on true events, whispers from a small California town where, one summer in 1976, children began to vanish. Witnesses spoke of a strange truck, old-fashioned, rusted, and a man behind the wheel with a face you don't forget. Some say it was an urban legend, others still hear the bells. This is the Ice Cream Man Murders. It was the summer of 1976 in Greenvale, California. A postcard town, 2 stoplights, 1 high school, and kids who knew better than to come home after the streetlights came on. The sun beat down like a curse that year, hot and dry, the air thick with honeysuckle and smoke from distant barbecues. Fireworks stores lined the highway, and American flags flapped from every porch in celebration of the country's bicentennial. But beneath all the red, white, and blue, something else was waiting. Something with skin like melted wax and eyes too wide to blink. It started with a sound, that soft, tinny jingle. Do your ears hang low, rising over the rooftops like a memory no one wanted. Tommy Wilkins was the first to hear it. 8 years old, scabbed knees, Braves cap. The kind of boy who always chased the music. He'd been playing with friends in a dirt lot off Holloway Lane when he suddenly froze, cocked his head and whispered, "Ice cream truck." The others looked, squinted. Nothing. Tommy dropped his bat, hopped on his banana seat bike and pedaled toward the sound. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. An hour later, his bike was found resting gently against a tree at the edge of the woods. One wheel still spinning. His cap lay beside it in the grass, and on the pavement, a single vanilla cone, tipped over, its contents seeping into the dirt like blood. No footprints, no tire marks, no witnesses. Just one child gone. By the end of the week, 2 more were missing. All under the age of 10. All last seen alone. And all claimed to have heard the truck. But this time, there were sightings. A few neighborhood kids began to whisper about the ice cream man himself. They said he had a face, but not one you'd want to see. "He looked burned," said one boy, like a candle melted and turned into a person. "He smiled too much," said another, "but only with his mouth. His eyes didn't move." Others said he wore an old paper hat and an apron soaked with something dark. His teeth were crooked, yellow, and too many in number. And when he handed out ice cream, he never spoke, just stared, letting the music play. Some kids accepted the ice cream. Others ran. Those who ran survived. The others didn't come back. Word spread fast. Parents began watching their children like hawks. Doors were locked. Kids kept inside. The sheriff added patrols, but they never saw the truck, never heard the bells. But one man did. Frank Cowell, a local mechanic and veteran, swore he saw the truck parked behind the abandoned mill near the train yard. Said it was real, battered, paint peeling, but real. He told his brother-in-law, a man named Rick Moretti. Together they hatched a plan. That night they waited in Frank's pickup truck, parked across from the mill, shotguns on their laps and a cooler of beer between them. At 2:14 a.m. the music started, slow, warped, too slow. Then came the truck, rolling out from the shadows, its headlights off, the melody echoing in the dead air. Frank stepped out first, Rick followed. What happened next, no one can say exactly. Their bodies were found the next morning, slumped beside the old brick wall near the train yard. Both had been gutted, not shot, not stabbed, torn open, as if by claws. Rick's shotgun was still in his hands, never fired. Their faces were contorted in terror, and between them, lying neatly on the ground, 2 small paper cups. Vanilla swirl. Rainbow sprinkles. Melted in the heat. Something was hunting in Greenvale. And now, it wasn't just after the children. By mid-July, Greenvale was no longer a town. It was a trap. Children were kept indoors. Tricycles gathered dust. The sounds of summer, laughter, sprinklers, bouncing balls had fallen away, replaced by the hiss of static from televisions left on in every room. As if the noise, alone, could keep something out. The sheriff issued statements. Patrols were doubled. Curfews enforced. But behind every front door, the same question burned like a fever. How do you catch a man who shouldn't exist? On the edge of town lived a man named Henry Bell. 86 years old. Lived alone. Kept mostly to himself. Folks said he'd once been a school teacher. Others said he'd served in the war. No one really knew. But when Frank Cowell and Rick Moretti turned up, dead, torn open like sacks of flour, Henry came down to the police station with a newspaper clipping in his hand and a look in his eye that said, "I've seen this before." The clipping was dated August 4th, 1949. A different town, same pattern. 4 children gone in 2 weeks. 2 adults found eviscerated after pursuing a suspicious vehicle into the woods. The article mentioned the driver of the vehicle. A man described by children as tall, with burned features, wearing a white apron and a paper soda jerks cap. Henry dropped the clipping on the sheriff's desk and said quietly, "He was here once before." They dismissed him. Too old, too scared, too superstitious. But Henry didn't stop talking. Not to them, but to others, to anyone who would listen. He stood outside the grocery store with copies of the article, showed it to kids on bicycles, told them not to follow the bells. "His name's not important," Henry would say. "He don't need one. All he needs is music." One woman did listen, Marianne Elliott, a mother of 2. Her youngest, Lucy, had started humming a tune she couldn't name, over and over, whenever she was alone. When asked where she'd heard it, Lucy said, "The man in the hat gave it to me." "What man?" "He waved at me through the window." "When?" "When Daddy was asleep on the couch. He didn't hear him." Marianne checked every window, every door, all locked. But out on the front walk was a stick figure drawn in sidewalk chalk. 5 limbs, wide smile, and a hat, a paper hat. That night, Marianne went to Henry Bell. She didn't have to say a word. He simply nodded and said, "He's back." Then he pulled out a tape recorder, an old dusty reel-to-reel, and pressed play. Halfway through the song, the melody cracks. Beneath it, something else. Not lyrics, not notes. A voice. Whispering, too soft to understand, too clear to mistake for imagination. The truck didn't just play music, it spoke. Beneath the notes, behind the bells. And Henry believed that those who listened long enough began to understand what it was saying. Greenvale had always thought it was the kind of town that bad things passed by. But now the walls were peeling, the ground was cracking, and something old was rolling down their streets again. Something with a scarred face, too many teeth, and music that wormed its way straight into your bones. The next morning, Marianne Elliott found her daughter sitting at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a red crayon. She'd been up before dawn, eyes wide, unmoving, humming to herself in a breathy little voice. That same tune, off-key, childlike. Marianne leaned in. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" Lucy didn't look up. "I'm drawing what he told me to." The paper was covered in jagged red lines, not scribbles, something deliberate. At the center, a figure standing next to what looked like a truck. The figure's head was too large, too round. His face, warped, shaded over, as if the crayon had been pressed too hard. His mouth stretched across his face, red and wide, and where his eyes should have been, nothing, just holes. Above the truck, Lucy had written in big, uneven letters, "The cold man comes when you're alone." That same day, 4 more parents reported strange behavior in their children. Sleepwalking, humming, drawing the same twisted figure. One boy was found standing in his backyard at 3 a.m, barefoot, facing the woods, arms outstretched like he was waiting for something to take his hand. Another girl carved a spiral into her bedroom wall, using the edge of a Barbie doll's shoe. When asked why, she said, "So he knows where I sleep." Word spread quickly. Henry Bell tried again, offering the tape to the sheriff's office, the same one with the voice under the music. This time, he wasn't dismissed. He was escorted out of the building and told politely not to return. So Henry went to the only place he knew people would listen, the library. He met with Marianne. Together they went through old town records, buried newspaper clippings from the 40s, 50s, 60s. Each time the ice cream man appeared, it was the same pattern. Children disappear. Music is heard by only a few. Adults try to intervene and die. And someone always draws him. Marianne didn't sleep that night. She sat with Lucy in the living room, lights on, shotgun in her lap. Her husband, Jim, had taken to drinking and silence. Around 3:20 a.m., the bells returned. Software, slower than before. The curtains swayed even though no windows were open. Lucy stirred on the couch, opened her eyes. "He's here." Marianne rushed to the window. Nothing, just their yard. The porch, the street beyond. Still, but in the middle of their front walk, placed neatly on the welcome mat, was another drawing. The same figure, the same truck. Only this time the house was burning behind them. She tore the picture to shreds. But Lucy only smiled in her sleep and whispered, "You can't stop him. He already rang the bell." The ice cream man didn't just visit Greenvale. He moved in. The boy's name was Jacob Langley, 7 years old. Vanished on July 14th while riding his scooter around the block. His mother said he'd only been gone 10 minutes, long enough for the ice cream truck to make its pass. Neighbors claimed they never saw the truck, but one man said he heard the bells from inside his garage. He was working on his lawnmower when the music drifted in, and then stopped, like someone had cut the cord. Jacob was gone for 3 days. No ransom note, no signs of abduction, just silence. And then, on the 4th day, just after midnight, he came home. His mother found him standing in the kitchen, barefoot and dripping wet like he'd walked through a river. His clothes were clean, but didn't fit right. Older, tighter. His skin was ice cold to the touch, and he wouldn't speak, just stared at her, wide-eyed, then smiled, too wide. The doctors called it shock, trauma, said he'd come back on his own, that he'd found his way home, and couldn't remember the details. But there were other things, stranger things. His dog Daisy wouldn't go near him. His eyes didn't always track the same way. And when he started humming in his sleep, his mother finally recognized the tune. "Do your ears hang low?" She asked him gently where he'd been. He replied, "In the freezer." What freezer, baby? The one with all the kids in it. We have to stay cold or we melt. The therapist dismissed it as metaphor. Children process trauma in strange ways, she said. But then the drawing started. Jacob filled a notebook with sketches of children, dozens of them, all with empty eyes and mouths shaped into ovals, as if screaming. One page simply read, "He collects us." His mother, now frantic, brought the notebook to Henry Bell. Henry didn't speak for a long time, just flipped through the pages slowly, as if remembering something he hadn't wanted to remember. Finally, he looked up and said, "That boy didn't come back. Not the way he left." 2 nights later, the Langley home caught fire. Investigators ruled it electrical, but neighbors saw something before the flames reached the 2nd floor. A shape in the yard, tall, lean, wearing white, standing perfectly still beneath the porch light, and in its hand, a scoop, dripping red. Jacob's body was never recovered. Not fully, just bone fragments. Tissue, not enough to bury. But the next week, another drawing appeared on Lucy's front porch. This time it showed 2 trucks and twice as many children. There was a time when Greenvale believed the ice cream man only took children. But now they knew the truth. He took whatever he wanted. And sometimes he gave something back. There was a place in Greenvale everyone forgot about. An old meat-packing plant that closed in the 1960s. 3 stories tall, red brick faded to gray. It sat near the train tracks on the south side of town, wrapped in rusted fencing and covered in graffiti. Kids called it the slaughterhouse and dared each other to throw rocks at the boarded-up windows. But no one went inside, not until the dreams started. Lucy began waking up screaming. Night after night she'd bolt upright, eyes wide, soaked in sweat, whispering the same phrase, "It's cold under the train." She'd draw the same image each time, a staircase, metal and narrow, leading down beneath the earth, and a long silver door with frost around the edges. Marianne showed the drawings to Henry Bell. He nodded grimly. There was a freezer room under the old plant, he said. Walk-in, industrial, big enough to store sides of beef, maybe bigger. No one had been inside in decades. So they went. Just Henry, Marianne, and a bolt cutter. They parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance in silence, the night too still, the stars unusually bright. The plant loomed like a forgotten giant, its windows black, the air around it colder than it should have been. The door was rusted but gave way easily. Inside, everything was dust and darkness. But as they made their way through the narrow halls and rusted machinery, a new smell began to rise. Not rot, cold, clean, sterile. They found the stairs in the back, hidden behind a sheet of plywood and rusted metal. They were narrow, steep, and led to a heavy steel door sealed with a wheel lock. Marianne's breath froze as she reached out and turned it. Inside was the freezer, still functional, still running somehow. The walls were lined with long steel drawers like morgue slabs, but smaller, child-sized. A single hanging light buzzed overhead, flickering, and on the floor, written in chalk, was a message. The cold keeps them fresh. They opened the first drawer. Empty, the second. Another child's drawing, crumpled, wet with condensation. It showed a row of trucks, and behind them a giant mouth in the earth. The third drawer held something worse, a shoe, tiny, red, dusted with frost. The name Kayla Monroe was written inside the tongue. She'd been missing for nearly a month. They opened 5 more drawers, each one colder than the last. In one, they found Jacob Langley's missing notebook, frozen stiff, the pages stuck together. In another, a lock of hair tied with a rubber band. But in the last drawer, they found the ice cream man's paper hat, soaked, yellowed, cracked with age. And beneath it, a cassette tape, unlabeled. They took it and left. Never spoke a word as they locked the place behind them and vanished back into the dark. That night, Henry played the tape. Click. A soft hiss. Then the familiar jingle. Do your ears hang low, slowed, echoing. But this time, the voice beneath the music was louder, clearer. I come when you call me. I stay where you keep me. The cold keeps me sleeping, but I am never alone. Greenvale had tried to bury the past, tried to forget, but beneath the train tracks the truth waited, and now the freezer was empty. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the truck returned to Greenvale. It moved silently down Main Street like a hearse made of rust and memory, its paint flaking off in strips, its wheels gliding over the pavement like it wasn't really touching the ground. No one called the police. They didn't have to. Sheriff Daniels was already waiting. He stood on the front steps of Town Hall alone, one hand resting on his holster, the other holding a flashlight that flickered against the truck's peeling surface. His breath fogged in the warm summer air. The truck rolled to a stop directly in front of him. Its music had stopped. The engine was silent. The only sound now was the faint clicking of something cooling down or waking up. Daniels stepped forward. Cautiously, his flashlight beam swept across the windshield. No movement, no driver, just the cracked vinyl bench seat and a small pink paper hat resting exactly where a head should have been. He moved closer until he was inches from the driver's side window. Still nothing. The keys were in the ignition. The glove compartment hung open, empty. The air inside was cold, unnaturally cold, like the breath of a walk-in freezer. He called for backup, but the radio buzzed with static. Then, a whisper. Not yet. Daniels backed away slowly. His hand trembled, not from fear, from knowing. By morning, the truck was gone. No tire tracks, no oil stains. Just 2 shallow grooves in the pavement, as if something had been dragged backward into the dark. People left Greenvale after that. Quietly, quickly. No announcements, just for sale signs, empty driveways, and curtains that never moved again. The sheriff stayed, kept his office open, filed his reports, but never spoke about that night. Not to anyone. Because what do you say about a truck that drives itself? That comes when the bells ring. That waits in silence. And somewhere, even now, beneath all that silence, the engine's still running. Thank you for joining us this evening for another tale where true crime meets the shadows of horror. The bells may have stopped for now, but the ice cream man is still out there, waiting, watching, and sometimes still ringing. If you enjoyed tonight's story, tap that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have much more in store for you, more true crime, more horror, and more long sleepless nights. Until next time, stay safe and keep your doors locked.